This morning, 7 years after she was sent to prison for the murder of her mother in Bali. Heather Mack is a free woman once again.
Mack, now 26 years old, is in a detention room at an immigration office near Bali's airport. She is awaiting a flight to the U.S. Mack served 7 years of a 10-year prison sentence for helping kill her mother, wealthy Chicago socialite Sheila Vonwise.
She had spent decades building a life that looked, from the outside, like something out of a magazine: dinner parties with jazz musicians, charity galas, luxury travel, and a grand Chicago home filled with music and ambition. Sheila had survived a difficult marriage, raised a difficult daughter, and buried a husband in a foreign country, and still she kept reaching for something better. She believed, truly, deeply believed, that one last trip could fix everything. She boarded that plane to Bali with hope. She would never board a plane again. Her full name was Sheila Vonwise Mack. She was 62 years old, born on June 10, 1952, in the state of Minnesota, at a time when America was still finding its footing in the post-war world. She grew up middle class, one of 3 children, in a household that valued education, hard work, and the quiet dignity of a well-lived life. As a little girl, Sheila loved being outdoors when the Minnesota weather allowed it, climbing trees with her siblings, soaking up whatever sunshine the upper Midwest grudgingly offered. But when the cold rolled in, as it almost always did, Sheila retreated indoors with a book. She was, by all accounts, a voracious reader from childhood, curious, sharp, and quietly determined to understand the world around her. That determination would define her entire life. Sheila was academically gifted in a way that set her apart from her peers. She earned a degree in political science, and almost immediately upon graduating, she stepped into rooms that most people only read about in newspapers. She went to work for Senator Ted Kennedy, one of the most prominent political figures in 20th century America, and later for Jackie Kennedy herself. Think about what that means for a moment. A girl from Minnesota, bookish and ambitious, suddenly moving through the highest corridors of American power. This was not luck. This was Sheila Vonwise Mack operating at full capacity. From politics, she transitioned into the world of Chicago's social elite. She took on charity work, hosted events, built a reputation as a woman of culture and sophistication. Chicago in the 1980s and early 1990s was a city of immense creative energy, particularly in the jazz world, and Sheila found herself drawn deeply into that scene. She was not someone who sat at the edges of a party. She was the kind of woman who knew everyone in the room and made sure everyone felt known by her. Friends who knew her during this period describe a woman who was generous, opinionated, and fiercely intelligent. She had strong views about art, about politics, about how a dinner table should be set and what wine should accompany which course. She could be demanding. She could be intense. But those who loved her understood that her intensity came from a place of genuine passion. She cared deeply about almost everything she touched. What is remarkable about Sheila's story is that she never stopped learning. In an era when most people considered their education complete the moment they received their first degree, Sheila kept going back. She earned one degree, then returned for another. And then in the early 1990s, she moved to Chicago to pursue a PhD. At a point in life when many of her peers were settling into comfortable routines, Sheila was sitting in lecture halls, writing papers, challenging herself intellectually. It was this third academic chapter that would change her personal life entirely, because it was in Chicago that she met James Mack. James was everything Sheila admired in a person. He was accomplished, creative, and deeply embedded in a world she found endlessly fascinating. A celebrated jazz musician with connections across the industry, James Mack was 22 years Sheila's senior, already in his 60s when they met, but their connection was immediate and undeniable. He had mentored future jazz composers, worked with the top record labels, and built a career that represented exactly the kind of artistic legacy Sheila respected. Together, they became a genuine Chicago power couple. Their home was always full: dinner parties, musicians dropping by the studio, industry friends lingering until late in the evening. From the outside, It was a picture of an extraordinary life. But pictures, as Sheila knew better than anyone, do not always tell the truth. Those close to the couple have described a relationship that, behind closed doors, carried real darkness. Allegations of physical and emotional abuse between them surfaced in the years that followed, with James identified by multiple sources as the primary aggressor, though his family from previous marriages maintained that the dynamic was more complicated than that. James had several adult children from prior relationships, and they alleged that Sheila worked to isolate him from them, turning off lights when they came to visit, pretending no one was home. His ex-wife reportedly filed a police complaint against Sheila for deliberately obstructing contact. Whatever the full truth of their marriage was, one thing is beyond dispute. In October of 1995, Sheila Vonwise Mack became a mother. She was 43 years old. She had feared it would never happen. And when her daughter arrived named Lois but always called Heather, Sheila poured every ounce of herself into that child. The way she parented was, by many accounts, unconventional. She took young Heather to the theater, to fine dining restaurants, to cultural events that most small children would find bewildering. She wanted to enrich her daughter, to give her standards, to raise a woman of the world. Whether those choices served Heather is a question this story will return to again and again. What is clear is that Sheila's love for her daughter was enormous, consuming, at times overwhelming, and ultimately the thing that would cost her everything. In 2001, James Mack suffered a serious injury aboard a cruise ship, a foot wound that was mishandled by the ship's medical team and left him partially paralyzed, requiring a wheelchair for the remainder of his life. A lawsuit against the cruise liner followed, stretching on for years. And then, when Heather was just 10 years old, James was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He began spending lavishly, taking the family around the world, trying to pour as much life as possible into whatever time remained. Their final destination together was Greece in 2006. It was there, in a hotel room, that James Mack died unexpectedly from a pulmonary embolism. He was gone before anyone could say goodbye properly. Sheila was left alone, widowed in a foreign country, with a grieving 10-year-old daughter, and a life that suddenly looked very different than it had just days before. She would spend the next 8 years trying to hold what remained together, trying to hold Heather together, never fully succeeding, never fully giving up. In the summer of 2014, she decided to try one more time, a luxury trip to Bali, just the two of them, a chance to heal. She had no idea that the danger she was flying toward was not waiting for her in Bali at all. It had been sitting across from her at the breakfast table for years, the daughter. There is a version of Heather Mack's story that invites sympathy. A little girl born into a household shadowed by alleged abuse, raised by a mother whose love was suffocating rather than nourishing, who lost her father in a foreign hotel room at the age of 10 and was made to stay on vacation afterward because the flights were already paid for. There is real pain in that version. There is real loss. But there is another version, and that version is written in police reports, court documents, text messages, and the testimony of people who watched what Heather became. Not what was done to her, but what she chose to do in return. The truth, as it almost always is, lives somewhere between those two versions. And to understand what happened in that Bali hotel room in August of 2014, you have to understand both. Heather's first name was actually Lois Heather Mack, but she never went by it. From the very beginning, she was Heather. She was born on October 11, 1995 in Chicago, Illinois, the only biological child of Sheila Vonwise Mack and James Mack. By every measurable standard, she was born into privilege. The family home was filled with music, with guests, with the trappings of an upper-class Chicago life. She would never want for material things. She would never go hungry. She would never wonder whether there was money for school supplies or winter clothes. What she would wonder about, what she would reportedly carry with her for her entire childhood, was whether she was safe inside her own home. Multiple people connected to this case have described the Mack household as one marked by domestic abuse. Heather herself would later claim, in various interviews and public statements, that she witnessed her father physically abusing her mother on multiple occasions, and that James Mack had, on at least one occasion, encouraged his young daughter to join in. These are deeply disturbing allegations, and while Heather Mack is, by the admission of virtually everyone who has followed this case, a profoundly unreliable narrator who has been caught changing her story repeatedly, she is not the only person who has spoken of dysfunction and abuse within that household. The pattern of what came next, Heather's behavior from as young as 6 years old, is consistent, at least in part, with a child processing something traumatic. Family friend Diana, who knew the Macks well, would later allege something equally troubling from the opposite direction, that Sheila herself was not without fault in how the mother-daughter relationship developed. Diana described Sheila as deeply, anxiously attached to Heather, codependent in a way that was unhealthy for both of them. She allegedly described Sheila provoking Heather during arguments, pushing her emotionally until Heather would lash out physically, and then being unable to cope when Heather was removed from the home, even temporarily, for psychiatric care. Whatever the root cause, the pattern of Heather's behavior was alarming from an extraordinarily young age. By the time she was 6, she was acting out violently enough that Sheila was calling the police on her own small child. By 13, she had allegedly locked her mother in a closet. By 14, she was punching Sheila's broken ankle, deliberately targeting the place where she knew she could cause maximum pain. By 15, she had pushed her mother with enough force to break her arm, resulting in Heather's first arrest for domestic battery. By the time Heather turned 18, Chicago police had been called to the Mack family home 86 times. 86 times. What the psychiatric evaluations, and there were several, because Sheila repeatedly sought help through medical channels when she refused to pursue criminal charges, consistently failed to produce, was a diagnosis. Heather was assessed multiple times, and each time was found to be of sound mind. No disorder that could explain the escalating violence was ever formally identified and documented in a way that satisfied the courts or the clinicians involved. What those evaluations may have missed, or what may simply have been developing beneath the surface, was a capacity for coldness that went beyond ordinary adolescent rebellion. Heather did not just lash out in anger. She strategized. She targeted weak points. She disconnected phone lines so her mother could not call for help while she lay injured. She stole credit cards not impulsively but repeatedly, systematically, with clear intent. And when confronted, she did not feel guilt. She felt inconvenienced. This is the Heather Mack who, in June of 2014, reconnected at a party with a young man she had known peripherally since high school. His name was Tommy Schieffer. Thomas Vincent Schieffer was born on July 13, 1993 in the Chicago area and raised primarily by his mother after his father left when Tommy was still very young. Unlike Heather, Tommy did not grow up with money. His mother worked hard to provide a stable home, and by most accounts, Tommy's early childhood was unremarkable in the best possible way. He was polite, academically capable, socially normal. He had friends. He had prospects, however modest. The unraveling began in his teenage years, and it began with lying. Tommy developed a habit of fabricating stories about himself, telling people he had a life-threatening heart condition, constructing an image of himself that was more interesting, more dramatic, more worthy of attention than the reality he actually inhabited. His friends began to distance themselves. By the time he reached his late teens, he had lost most of his social circle and was increasingly isolated. He dropped out of college. He began pursuing music under the name Tommy X, a SoundCloud rapper with ambition that far outpaced his output. He had no stable income, no clear direction, and a growing sense that life was passing him by. In early 2014, Just 2 months before he would meet Heather Mack at that party, Tommy lost his girlfriend Rachel in a car accident. They had been together for a year. He was 20 years old, grieving, adrift, and deeply vulnerable to anyone who offered him a sense of purpose. Heather offered him something considerably more dangerous than purpose. She offered him a number: $11 million. They reconnected in June of 2014 and began a relationship almost immediately. Heather was 18. Tommy was 21. From the very beginning, their dynamic was chaotic and volatile. But for Tommy, who had spent years feeling like an outsider looking in, Heather's intensity felt like aliveness. She was wild and unpredictable and entirely focused on him. And she was telling him that there was a fortune waiting, that the only obstacle between them and a life of unimaginable wealth was one person: her mother. As early as February 4th, 2014, months before they had even officially begun dating, Tommy had sent Facebook messages to a mutual friend referencing a conversation he had already had with Heather. According to those documented messages, Heather had asked him to find someone to kill her mother for $50,000. She had framed it as the one thing that would make her most happy. Tommy did not immediately act on it, but he did not walk away either. By the time summer arrived, Heather was pregnant with his child. By the time August approached, Tommy Schiefer had applied for a passport and listed Indonesia in the countries he intended to visit. He was not planning a holiday. He was planning a murder, and he was doing it with the calm, almost bored energy of a young man who had convinced himself that this was simply what people did when they wanted a different life. He had no idea how wrong he was about almost everything: the money, the plan, the getaway, and the idea that any of this would make him happy. But by then, it was already too late for Sheila, the island that was supposed to save them. Bali is one of the most beautiful places on Earth. The kind of place people save up years to visit: terraced rice fields glowing green in the morning light, ocean air thick with frangipani, temples rising out of the mist like something from a dream. It is a place people go to heal, to reset, to find something they have lost. That is exactly why Sheila chose it. By the summer of 2014, her relationship with Heather had reached a breaking point that frightened even Sheila herself. She had told friends, in terms that were impossible to misunderstand, that she feared her own daughter, that she did not know what Heather was capable of, that things were escalating in ways she could no longer manage alone. And yet, despite all of that, despite the 86 police callouts, despite the broken bones, despite the stolen credit cards and the psychiatric hospitalizations and the court-ordered anger management sessions that changed nothing, Sheila could not bring herself to cut Heather off. She loved her, completely, irrationally to the very end. So she did what she had always done when the situation felt impossible. She reached for her checkbook and she reached for hope. She booked 2 business-class seats to Indonesia, $12,000 each, and she told herself that Bali would be different, that somewhere between the temples and the ocean and the distance from Chicago, she and her daughter would find their way back to each other. On August 2nd, 2014, Sheila Vonwise Mack and Heather Mack boarded their flight to Bali. They were already arguing before they landed. Their first stop was the W Resort in Seminyak, one of Bali's most glamorous coastal areas. It should have been extraordinary. The resort is the kind of place that appears in travel magazines: infinity pools overlooking the Indian Ocean, open-air restaurants, the constant sound of gamelan music drifting through the warm evening air. Instead, within days of arriving, Sheila was sending desperate emails to friends back in Chicago. On August 5th, she wrote to a friend saying she was afraid of Heather, that she wished they had never come. She described the extraordinary measures she had taken simply to protect herself and her belongings within the walls of a 5-star resort, instructing staff not to process any charges made by Heather, not to share the safe combination with her, not to allow her access to their shared hotel room unless Sheila was present to supervise. Read that again. A mother on a luxury holiday she had spent thousands of dollars on was essentially placing herself under protective custody from her own 18-year-old daughter. And then things got worse. Before they were due to move to their second hotel, the St. Regis Bali Resort in Nusa Dua, Heather disappeared entirely. She was unreachable by phone, and before she had gone, she had visited the hotel pharmacy, claimed to be Sheila, and charged a significant quantity of prescription painkillers to the room, far more than would be needed for recreational use, enough potentially to overdose a person. Sheila confided to friends in an email that night that she was terrified, not that Heather would hurt herself, but that the pills were intended for her. She was right to be afraid. She simply did not yet know how right. Heather eventually reappeared, and the two of them moved to the St. Regis Resort in Nusa Dua, a property of almost surreal elegance, all white marble and manicured gardens and butlers who appear before you have finished forming a request. It was here, using Sheila's stolen credit card, that Heather quietly arranged for Tommy Schiefer to fly from Chicago to Bali. She booked him a private room on the 6th floor, room 616, at over $1,000 per night. Sheila knew nothing about any of it. Tommy arrived just after midnight on August 12, 2014. He was escorted to his room. Within hours, Heather had slipped out of the room she shared with her mother on the 3rd floor and gone to meet him. The two of them walked the resort grounds together in the small hours of the morning. Security footage would later capture them moving through the property, speaking quietly, heads close together. They were finalizing a plan that had been months in the making. Around 2:45 a.m., they parted ways. Heather returned to room 317. Tommy went back to the 6th floor. They began communicating by text, a conversation that would become, in the months and years that followed, some of the most chilling documented evidence in the history of the case. At approximately 3:30 a.m., Sheila woke to find Heather's bed empty. She went downstairs in a panic to alert the lobby staff, who were preparing to search the grounds when Heather strolled in, entirely unbothered. A furious argument erupted in full view of the hotel staff. Sheila had by now discovered that her credit card had been used to book both a flight and a hotel room for Tommy. She told Heather, in no uncertain terms, that Tommy would have to pay for his own room, and that the moment they returned to America, she would pursue criminal charges for credit card fraud. They returned to room 317 somewhere around 3:45. The argument continued until almost 6:00 a.m. At that point, Sheila called the front desk and asked for a wake-up call at 10:30 in the morning. Then she tried to sleep. She would never wake up on her own again. Between 8:35 and 8:40 a.m., the St. Regis security cameras recorded Tommy Schiefer stepping into the elevator on the 6th floor. Concealed beneath his shirt was an iron fruit bowl stand taken from his hotel room. It was heavy. It was solid. It had been chosen deliberately. Heather had left the door to room 317 slightly ajar so that he could enter without knocking, without making noise, without waking Sheila before he was ready. What happened inside that room over the next hour and 20 minutes is reconstructed from forensic evidence, autopsy findings, and the text messages that Heather and Tommy exchanged in real time. Messages so cold, so tactical, so entirely devoid of human feeling that investigators and journalists who later read them described a sense of profound disorientation. This was not the language of passion or rage. It was the language of logistics. Tommy hid. Sheila was awake, conscious and moving, aware that something felt wrong. The texts reveal Heather directing Tommy moment by moment, telling him when Sheila was facing away, telling him to wait, telling him it was too dangerous not to act. At one point, she texted him to suffocate her mother. When he hesitated, she instructed him to use the fruit stand. At some point during this exchange, Tommy's phone battery died. The text stopped. He came out of hiding. Together, Tommy delivering the blows. Heather holding her hand over her own mother's mouth to silence her screams. They beat Sheila Vonwise Mack to death. She was 62 years old. She fought back. The defensive wounds on her arms confirmed it. Her hand was broken. Her neck was broken. Her jaw and nose were fractured. Her skull was severely damaged. The official cause of death was blunt force trauma causing obstruction of airflow and asphyxiation. She suffocated in her own hotel room while her daughter watched. At 10:02 a.m., Tommy texted his cousin Robert back in Chicago. The message read, "Had everywhere, blood everywhere." He said he did not feel bad. They stuffed Sheila's body, broken, half-dressed, barely fitting, into her own small suitcase. Heather sat on top of it so Tommy could force the zipper closed. They wrapped it in plastic and bound it with tape borrowed from the front desk. They scattered blood-stained linens across multiple floors of the hotel in what passed in their minds for a cleanup operation. At 11:30 a.m., they loaded a luggage cart with 2 suitcases, one ordinary, one containing the body of a woman who had spent 62 years building a life, and attempted to check out of the St. Regis Resort. A staff member noticed a dark red liquid seeping from the sealed case. She asked Heather what it was. "Make up," Heather said, and kept walking. They hailed a taxi outside the resort. Tommy loaded both suitcases into the boot. They told the driver they would be right back. Then they walked back inside and never returned. The taxi driver waited over an hour before opening the boot. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The taxi driver who changed everything. His name has been largely kept from the international press, and perhaps that is as it should be. He was simply a man doing his job, a Balinese taxi driver who had been waiting outside the St. Regis Resort for over an hour, watching the clock, losing money, growing frustrated with 2 young passengers who had told him they would be right back and then vanished entirely. When he finally climbed out of the driver's seat and walked to the boot to retrieve the abandoned luggage, he was expecting to feel annoyed. Instead, he felt something closer to terror. The smaller of the 2 suitcases had changed since he had first loaded it. The plastic wrapping that covered it was now visibly saturated. A dark red liquid had pooled at the base of the boot. The smell was metallic and wrong in a way that was impossible to rationalize away. This man, who owed Sheila Vonwise Mack nothing and had never met her in his life, made a decision in that moment that mattered enormously. He did not leave the suitcase by the road. He did not walk away. He got back into his car, and he drove directly to the police station. Balinese police opened the suitcase at approximately 1:00 p.m. on August 13, 2014. Inside, contorted into a space no human body should ever occupy, was Sheila. She was partially undressed. Her legs had been forced up behind her head to make her fit. She was covered in bruises, in wounds, in the evidence of a prolonged and savage attack. Officers who were present at the scene would later describe the state of the suitcase as one of the most disturbing things they had encountered in their careers. Balinese law enforcement moved with remarkable speed from that moment forward. Within hours of the discovery, police had descended on the St. Regis Resort in Nusa Dua. Staff, who had already been quietly unnerved by the behavior of the 2 young American guests throughout their stay, cooperated fully and immediately. They pointed investigators directly to rooms 317 and 616. They recounted Sheila's specific and unusual requests, the instructions about the safe, about Heather's access to the room, about not processing charges made by her daughter. They described the luggage cart. They described the taped suitcase. They described Heather's response when a staff member noticed the leaking red liquid. "Make up," she had said, and kept walking. When police knocked on the doors of both rooms, nobody answered. Heather and Tommy were already gone, but what they left behind was, from an investigator's perspective, almost generous in its abundance. Room 317 was a forensic landscape. Blood had soaked into the mattress, the floor, the walls. Blood-stained linens that had been scattered across multiple floors of the hotel were collected and cataloged. A Victoria's Secret t-shirt belonging to Heather was recovered from the room, a dark blood stain across the front that would later be confirmed through DNA testing to belong to Sheila Vonwise Mack. Heather would later claim, in one of the many versions of events she would offer over the years, that the blood had transferred onto her shirt when she gave her mother's body a final hug goodbye. It was, like almost everything Heather Mack said in the years that followed, a statement that collapsed entirely under the weight of the physical evidence surrounding it. While police were processing the crime scene, Heather and Tommy were discovering in real time just how poorly they had planned their escape. The first obstacle was Heather's passport, which was locked in the hotel room safe, a safe that only Sheila knew the combination to, and which hotel staff had been specifically instructed not to open for Heather under any circumstances. Without the passport, Heather could not board an international flight. Without an international flight, she could not leave Bali. They went to the airport anyway, apparently believing they could obtain a replacement passport there. They could not. Passport replacement is handled through embassies, not airports. Failing that, they checked into a budget hotel directly adjacent to the airport, using Sheila's credit card in their real names. By this point, Balinese police had issued a public alert with both of their photographs and names. Hotel staff at the airport property recognized them the moment they checked in and contacted law enforcement immediately. At 8:00 a.m. on August 14, 2014, less than 24 hours after Sheila's body had been found, Balinese police entered the hotel room where Heather Mack and Tommy Schiefer were sleeping soundly and placed them both under arrest. They were taken to separate interrogation rooms. Their cover stories, apparently rehearsed, were identical in their broad strokes and equally implausible in their details. Both claimed they had witnessed Sheila being murdered by an armed gang. Both claimed they had been threatened themselves. Both claimed they had been too frightened to go to the police. The story evaporated almost immediately upon contact with the physical evidence, the hotel's CCTV footage, and the contents of their phones. If the crime scene provided the forensic foundation of the prosecution's case, the phones provided its soul. Investigators recovering the text message history from both Heather's and Tommy's devices found not a crime of passion, not a spontaneous act of violence, but a documented conspiracy stretching back months, complete with coded language, real-time play-by-play narration of the murder as it unfolded, and celebratory messages sent to Tommy's cousin Robert while Sheila's body was still in the room. The messages to Robert were particularly damning for Tommy's later claim that he had been emotionally manipulated by Heather into participating against his will. His own words, sent independently from his own device, in moments when Heather could not possibly have been influencing him, described his excitement about the money, his anticipation about the plan, his cousin's encouragement. Robert had told him that Sheila was not a good person and that no positive energy would be released from her body when she died. He had told him it was go time. He had responded to the news that it was done with comments that treated Sheila's murder as a financial transaction completed successfully. Robert Bibbs, Tommy's cousin, was subsequently charged back in the United States with conspiracy to commit murder. He eventually accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 9 years in American federal prison. The trial in Bali. The formal trial of Heather Mack and Tommy Schiefer began on January 14, 2015. Heather was 7 months pregnant at the time. The Indonesian court system operates differently from its American counterpart. There is no jury. Guilt or innocence is determined by a panel of judges who weigh evidence, testimony, and legal argument. And in Indonesia, a murder conviction carries the possibility of the death penalty, administered by firing squad. Both defendants were acutely aware of this throughout the proceedings. Their defense strategies were consistent with everything that had come before: a moving target. They claimed self-defense. They claimed Sheila had attacked them first, had searched for a knife, had tried to strangle Tommy. They claimed the murder was accidental, a panicked response to an aggressive act by a 62-year-old woman who had been beaten so severely that her neck and jaw were broken, and her skull was fractured in multiple places. The judges were not persuaded. The text messages were presented in their entirety. The forensic evidence was presented. The CCTV footage showing Tommy entering the elevator with the fruit stand concealed beneath his shirt was presented. The testimony of hotel staff who had observed Heather's behavior throughout the stay, the stolen credit card, the suspicious suitcase, the make-up explanation for the leaking blood was presented. Heather's Victoria's Secret t-shirt, stained with her mother's blood, was presented. On April 21, 2015, the panel of judges delivered their verdict. Guilty. Both of them. Tommy Schieffer was sentenced to 18 years in Karabakan prison, the facility known internationally, and grimly, as Hotel K. Heather Mack received 10 years for her role in planning and enabling the murder, with the court taking into account that she had not personally delivered the fatal blows and that she was a first-time offender under Indonesian law. To many observers, particularly in the United States, both sentences felt inadequate for the premeditated murder of a 62-year-old woman. The understanding, however, was always that these sentences represented only the Indonesian chapter of the legal reckoning. Both defendants were expected to be extradited to the United States upon completion of their Balinese sentences, where federal charges awaited them. Sheila's family and friends, many of whom had followed the proceedings from Chicago, received the verdict with the complicated relief that comes not from satisfaction, but from the simple confirmation that the truth had been officially recognized. She had been murdered. Her killers had been found guilty. The world knew what had happened to her. It was not enough. It never is, but it was something. Outside the courtroom in Chicago, people who had known Sheila, who had sat at her dinner table, who had laughed with her, who had watched her love a daughter who would betray her in the most final way imaginable, grieved quietly for a woman who had spent her last years trying to save a relationship that was already, in ways she could not have fully understood, designed to destroy her. Her name had been spoken in courtrooms on the other side of the world. Her story had been on the front pages of newspapers in 2 countries, and still, at the center of all of it, she remained what she had always been. A woman who loved too much and trusted the wrong person with that love. What remains? There is a particular kind of grief that comes with cases like this one. It is not the clean, devastating grief of a random tragedy, a car accident, an illness, a sudden loss that makes no sense but at least carries no betrayal within it. The grief that surrounds Sheila Vonwise Mack's murder is tangled and complicated and shot through with questions that do not have satisfying answers. How does a mother love a child so completely, so relentlessly, so against all available evidence that she boards a plane to paradise with the very person who has been planning her death for months? How does a daughter look at the woman who gave her life and see only an obstacle? How do we, as a society, make sense of a story in which love and violence are so thoroughly, so grotesquely intertwined? We may not be able to answer those questions fully, but we can refuse to look away from them. In the years since Sheila's murder, her story has become one of the most widely discussed true crime cases to emerge from the 2010s, covered by major American newspapers, international broadcasters, documentary filmmakers, and podcast producers who have collectively introduced her name to millions of people who never had the privilege of sitting at her dinner table or hearing her talk about a book she had just finished. That attention has been, for those who loved her, both a comfort and a wound. A comfort because it means she is not forgotten. A wound because the version of her that tends to travel furthest is the version defined entirely by how she died, rather than by how she lived. Those who knew Sheila have been consistent in one thing above all others. She was more than this case. She was more than a body in a suitcase. She was a woman who worked for 2 of the most prominent figures in 20th century American public life. She was a woman who went back to school 3 times because she could not stop being curious about the world. She was a woman who threw dinner parties that people still talk about, who cared passionately about art and music and the texture of a well-made life. She was flawed and complicated and real, and she deserved to grow old. Heather Mack served her Indonesian sentence at Karabakan Prison, Hotel K, under conditions that generated considerable controversy both within Bali and internationally. While the prison itself was documented as overcrowded, disease-ridden, and deeply corrupt, Heather appeared, from the social media posts she made on a contraband phone, to be living a life that bore little resemblance to incarceration as most people understand it. She wore designer clothing. She attended dance classes. She posed for photographs with other inmates and captioned them with statements that read more like vacation updates than prison dispatches. She also gave birth to her daughter, Stella, in February of 2015, halfway through the Balinese trial. Under Indonesian law, mothers are permitted to keep their newborns with them in prison for the first 2 years of the child's life. Stella spent her earliest years inside Karabakan Prison, a fact that is difficult to contemplate regardless of one's feelings about her mother. In 2017, Heather uploaded a series of videos to a now-deleted YouTube channel in which she made extraordinary and shifting claims about the case, at one point alleging that she alone had committed the murder and that Tommy was entirely innocent, claiming she had manipulated his phone and fabricated text messages. She later retracted everything, saying Tommy had blackmailed her into making the videos. The retractions changed nothing legally. The original sentences were upheld. In 2019, she gave a lengthy interview to a journalist in which she described her childhood in terms that were more detailed and more damning towards Sheila than anything she had previously said publicly, alleging alcohol and drug addiction, physical abuse, extreme psychological control. Some of these allegations found partial support in the testimony of people who had known the family. Others appeared nowhere in the documented record and arrived years after any corroboration was possible. On October 29, 2021, Heather Mack was released from Karabakan Prison early, having received credit for good behavior. She was deported from Indonesia with her 6-year-old daughter Stella. She believed, apparently, that she was going home to a free life. She was wrong. On November 3, 2021, the flight carrying Heather Mack landed in Chicago. Federal agents were waiting. She was arrested immediately upon landing and charged with conspiracy to kill a United States national in a foreign country, a federal offense carrying the possibility of life imprisonment. Stella was taken into temporary care, while a custody dispute was resolved in court. Tommy Schiefer's mother and Sheila's niece both sought custody of the child. Ultimately, the court awarded custody to Sheila's niece, Heather's own cousin, who was, in a quietly poignant detail, a member of the family that Heather's actions had shattered. Little Stella, who had known nothing but uncertainty and transition in her short life, went to live with the relatives of the grandmother she would never know. The judge overseeing the custody matter noted that despite everything, Stella appeared to be growing into a resilient and remarkable little girl. She would have contact with her mother via video call from prison. How much that contact has meant to either of them, and how it has shaped a child who carries within her the legacy of one of the most disturbing family crimes in recent American history, is something only time will reveal. On June 16, 2023, Heather Mack appeared in a United States federal court and pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to kill a United States national abroad. She was sentenced to 26 years in federal prison. Taking into account time already served in Indonesia, she will likely be in her late 40s or early 50s before she is released. By then, Stella will be a fully grown adult woman, having lived her entire conscious life without her mother present, shaped by people who were themselves shaped by Sheila's absence. Tommy Schiefer was released from Karabakan Prison on February 17, 2026. His sentence reduced by 75 months and 120 days for good behavior. He stepped out of the prison gates to a crowd of photographers and journalists and kissed a woman who had kept her identity largely private, widely reported to be a girlfriend he had developed a relationship with during his imprisonment. He told the cameras he was feeling good. He said God was good. He was transferred almost immediately to Bali's immigration detention center, and within days was deported back to the United States. Federal charges, conspiracy to kill a United States national abroad and tampering with evidence, were widely expected to be waiting for him upon his return to American soil, mirroring the charges that had already sent Heather to federal prison. Notably, Tommy had been eligible for parole as early as 2022, but turned it down, reportedly because he felt he had not yet fully repaid his debt for what he had done. That decision, whatever its motivation, speaks to a man who has undergone some form of internal reckoning during his years in Balinese custody, though what that reckoning truly amounts to is known only to him. Robert Bibbs, Tommy's cousin who had enthusiastically encouraged the murder from thousands of miles away via text message, served his 9-year sentence in American federal prison. His status upon release has not been widely reported. The case of Sheila Vonwise Mack forces us to look directly at several things we would generally prefer to look away from. It forces us to look at the way family dysfunction can calcify over decades into something genuinely dangerous, and at how the systems meant to interrupt that process, from police call-outs to psychiatric evaluations to court-ordered therapy, repeatedly failed to do so. 86 police visits to a family home over the course of one child's childhood is not a statistic. It is a systemic failure dressed up as a statistic. It forces us to look at the way money and inheritance can warp relationships into something unrecognizable, and at how easily a young man with no prospects and no moral anchor can be recruited into violence with the promise of wealth he does not fully understand and will never actually receive. Tommy Schiefer went to Bali believing he would come back a millionaire. He came back, more than a decade later, facing federal charges and carrying the knowledge of what he had done in that hotel room. It forces us to look at the complexity of victimhood. Sheila Vonwise Mack was not a perfect person. The evidence suggests her relationship with her daughter was, at various points and in various ways, deeply unhealthy. She may have been controlling. She may have been codependent. She may have made choices as a mother that caused real harm. None of that, not a single part of it, diminishes what was done to her or reduces the weight of her loss. Imperfect people deserve to live. Complicated mothers deserve to grow old. Women who love too fiercely and trust too completely deserve better than to die alone and terrified in a hotel room, while their daughter holds a hand over their mouth. For Sheila, you were born in Minnesota on a June morning in 1952, and you spent 62 years filling every room you entered with intelligence and warmth and the particular energy of a person who has never stopped being interested in the world. You worked for senators and first ladies. You went back to school when most people would have stopped. You built a life in Chicago that people who knew you still speak about with genuine love. You threw dinner parties. You read books. You traveled. You fell in love with a jazz musician and became, later than you expected and more completely than you could have imagined, a mother. You were not a perfect mother. You were a human mother, complicated and devoted and sometimes suffocating and always present. You never stopped trying to reach your daughter. You never stopped believing that one more trip, one more conversation, one more gesture of love and generosity might be the thing that finally turned the tide. That belief was not a weakness. It was the purest expression of who you were. You boarded that plane to Bali because you loved her. That love was real. That love was yours. No verdict, no sentence, no true crime documentary can take it from you or reduce it to something shameful. You loved your child. You deserve to be loved safely in return. Her name was Sheila Vonwise Mack. She was 62 years old. She deserved every year she did not get. And the world, her world, the dinner party world, the jazz-filled Chicago world, the world of books and travel and relentless curiosity, has been quieter without her in it.